So this is the second legal work group meeting. We're focused on making model provisions to help counsel and other parties in procurement discussions. Before we start, here is the antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting. You can read the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. When it comes to what we're doing specifically here today, we're basically looking at how we can give examples to people of how they might include our standard for license compliance and our standard for security assurance in procurement discussions, documentation, contracts, and so on. Rather than starting from scratch on the previous call, we decided to look at the risk grid, a pre-existing document. There's a CC0 version of that available, and it is hosted in the OpenChain reference library. Taking that as a basis gives us a way to potentially build new model provisions in a format that people are relatively familiar with. I'm going to very quickly show you what I mean. So this is the risk grid. This is version 12 of it, a cleaned up version of version 11, which is a legacy version. The structure of this document is to have issues, and each issue is formatted by describing itself, any commentary about it, who is best placed to bear risk out of supplier or customer, some sample wording, and then arguments that the supplier or the customer can bring to the table around this issue, and perhaps negotiating about who is actually best placed to bear risk in the situation. Moving down here, just to give you an example, here's an overarching topics item. So this is a category, and under that we have the issue limitations and exclusions of liability. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Yep.
All right, great. I just wanted to
Yes.
make sure it was legible. Perfect. Okay, so as you can see, the way the risk grid works is to be pretty minimal. It's not intended to be verbose. Indeed, there's some arguments we could do with filling it out a little bit when we have time to help with commentary and so on. But essentially, it goes through any structure when it comes to limitations and exclusions of liability that might be useful before you get to sample wording. In this case, it's about the supplier's liability in connection with an agreement, and it contains some wording that allows you to structure it in various ways, depending on your goals. So this, as you can see, is extremely straightforward as an approach, and this was pioneered by people like Malcolm Bain, Andrew Katz, who's on the call, and another few people who built it over a nice period a couple of years back. Actually, Andrew, if I'm not mistaken, the risk grid is now 15 years old.
Wish you hadn't said that.
It suggests we've been doing this too long.
Yes, exactly.
Andrew and I wrote the first article on the risk grid 15 years ago, which is both beautiful and depressing.
Yes.
Right. We said, let's take this format. And because the risk grid contains language which is still potentially useful, we have general indemnity wording. This wording is nice and clear. It's good for people thinking. Maybe we can take this approach and use it for what we're doing. And with that in mind, I did precisely that. And I'm putting the link in the chat directly to this document, the model provision 0.1. Okay, so this particular document, model provision 0.1, is not intended to be canonical. It's not intended to be a solution. It's intended to just get us started. Okay, so here we can see an issue, the inclusion of OpenChain ISO IEC 5230. And commentary doesn't have anything. It's the supplier to bear risk. And you can see what I've put here. Sample wording, which honestly is just ripped out of the risk grid and twisted a bit, which suggests that the supplier will warrant that this software comes from an OpenChain program. And that program is optionally either under the control of the supplier or under the control of a provider to the supplier. And then the supplier warrants or further warrants, potentially as far as it's aware, that the software complies with the program guidelines outlined by the standard at the time of delivery. In other words, it not only went through the program, but it actually complies with the program. And then optionally, again, the supplier doesn't warrant that doing something with the software later means that it still complies with the standard. So that's the first chunk of let's brainstorm language I've thrown at the wall. And I've added a second one, which does precisely the same for our standard for security assurance. There's no differences there. So I wanted to throw open to the table, does that type of sample wording make sense to you in helping us with the model provisions?
I think that looks really good, actually. Yeah, yeah. So, Shay, what I'm about to do is I'm about to send you an email containing some wording that what I think would be useful as sort of stage 2 on from this. So this basically is helpful, obviously, for organisations that are OpenChain conformant. What I've also developed some warranties that basically divide OpenChain down into the characteristics that an OpenChain conformant
Mhm.
program should have. So it's for those organizations where you're procuring software from them. They have not necessarily gone through the OpenChain conformance process, but they're basically warranting that each of the individual characteristics is also correct, or that they've fulfilled those particular requirements. And I think if we think that's a good approach for those sort of suppliers that have not yet adopted the whole of the specification, then I'm sort of happy to share the drafting that I've
Oh
come up with
gosh, yes. No,
as
this
well.
would be fantastic. I hadn't thought of it, but it would be an ingenious method on the onboarding.
Yeah,
Many companies have
exactly,
said they're
exactly.
working on it, which seems to indicate they've got something, but not all done. Jeff, I see
Yeah,
you. It over to you.
I just want to say it's great to see this kicking off. Being on the other side of procurement, it's just nice to start seeing the documentation here. One thing I wanted to add, or at least put in as a request, is we see a big difference between on-premises software and SaaS delivered software, and just kind of keeping that in mind as we do the wording here. Where there's places where kind of like every day it's an update versus, oh, we released a version and every 6 months or every year we get an update, and how the OpenChain conformant program and the conditions that software was made under, if there's a difference between SaaS and on-premises, um, just keep that in mind in the wording here. And I haven't seen anything that doesn't apply itself to SaaS, but I think it just seems with SaaS, like every day is a new release. And
Right.
how does that affect the wording around the risk grid and the standards? So I want to put that out there as we start. Okay.
Absolutely. That's something to be mindful of. As you say, I think right now we're looking good. Um, and we haven't done anything to contradict it, but we do need to be mindful that we don't somehow assume that we're looking at a particular a particular thing. I started laughing because I just got Andrew's email and he said he put together some stuff. Look at this. Andrew put together a ton of stuff. That's fantastic. Okay, so looking at what Andrew's got here, these procurement warranties seem to cover a lot of items regarding stuff people could have done. I'm just going to pull down something here from content review and approval. So here down at the bottom, the supplier has adopted and documented a process for creating and managing a bill of materials that includes each open source component and its identified licenses from which the supplied software is comprised. Details of the process are appended to the supplier information pack. So that type of provision seems very useful. Andrew,
Yeah.
do you think I should copy paste this into the GitHub thing, or what would you run with?
Yes, although I've immediately thought of a couple of changes that need to be made. So if you could leave that with me, I'm sort of happy to. I mean, I think it's very small ones. I should be able to do them today. Um, it's yeah, but I mean, happy to sort of donate this to the cause so people can have a look at it if they think it's useful.
That would be great. That would be fantastic. Okay, so this is currently then in an early beta state. Given that our main document is in an early beta state too, if it's okay, what I'll do is I'll put this in at the bottom so we can play with it there as well, unless you strongly object.
No strong objections from me.
Okay, so I'm just going to pull up this document. Currently, by the way, this will be unformatted at the bottom. It needs formatting, so I'll deal with that. Okay, what I'm doing now is I am immediately about to commit this to our GitHub. I'm going to mark it as version 0.2. Okay. Apologies for my delay in actually getting this to you. I just need a moment. Right. Okay, so going back to our GitHub actual location. Oops, I apologize, that's not the GitHub location. Right. Model provisions 2. So now in our actual text at the bottom, I've included Andrew's specific provisions for us to work on. And that will allow us to quickly work on that and contribute. I mean, while I notice in our chat, we've had some notes. Okay, so we've got some notes, second paragraph, missing a word and so on. So Steve has some notes. One is a text error correction. Steve, you also had a note that generally the software doesn't comply with an OpenChain program. The organization does, and isn't more than the software and output of the program. So my read on this, Steve, is that in the case of the current provisions in play, what we're trying to do is look at the deliverable, the software deliverable, and double check it went through a program, as opposed to assessing the program itself, which might be different model provisions. Now that's my current way of thinking, but really we need the lawyers to chime in and say, well, that's nuts or not.
Well, I agree that's what the aim should be. I don't think that the wording is right to achieve that, since the software itself is not complying with the program. I think it's more that you want to say that they assert that the software has been through the program.
Good point. Just checking if others have any comments. I'm guessing people might be just reading this right now. Oh, in case there's any difficulty in reading it, I'm putting it into the chat so you can see Andrew's version. Okay. While we're waiting for people to have a chance to think about that, I'm just correcting the typo that you flagged. Okay. Okay. Okay, so my read on the language is that currently the language is actually talking about the software having coming through a program, because it's talking about the origin of the software. But as I understand it, you have a slightly different read. Can you expand on that so I can understand and maybe we can correct the language? Make it better.
I concur with what you say about the first paragraph. It's the second paragraph.
Ah, good point. Okay, that's a very good point. Maybe with the requirements of program guidelines, or does that not help at all?
Well, you don't know. I don't know what the program guidelines are. In fact, I'm not even sure whether the guidelines are specified. No, it's the objectives that aren't specified, isn't it?
Yep. Chris Ekron also asked a question, just have we previously discussed what control means in the context of a supplier to the supplier? And no, we did not discuss it yet. Any suggestions was my reply.
Yeah, hi Shane, and apologies, I'm new to this group. I guess control can mean a lot of things. I'm assuming that this is a chain, so there's some origination and then it gets passed to the next person and it gets passed to the next person or company.
Yeah.
And I don't really think legally a party really controls a supplier, at least in a legal sense, in most cases. I mean, unless you define the term, what you might have is a contractual obligation from a supplier that they represent, like this might represent, that it's developed pursuant to a conformant program, but that doesn't mean it's under the control of the subordinate supplier. So I was just wondering, I know that the word control must have meant someone who was the original author. I was wondering what the history of that is, and is that defined in a way that
No,
it's clear?
the honest history of that is that Shane is an idiot and was writing this thing out. And you're quite right. Maybe we could put it differently. For instance, under the legal entity of the supplier, for example, to define that the program is placed under the legal entity of the supplier or under the legal entity of a provider to the supplier. And therefore, it will be possible after that to make specific decisions of how you're going to deal with that legal entity. Would that be better?
Well, I'm open to other people's thoughts on this, but I think what people want to know is that the provenance of software through the chain has been consistently under a conformant program. And then I think what you need is a chain of similar representations,
Yeah.
similar but maybe not the same, through the entire chain, so that what is the requirement of due diligence of somebody that is looking back at their subcontractors, sub-suppliers? Is it sufficient for them to just get a certain form of language and that is the level of conformance they need? And then is it going to have to be some standardized language, or can it be, because I think there are going to be any number of varieties of ways that different people along the chain are going to secure a contractual assertion or guarantee that something has been through a conformant program. But that doesn't necessarily always, it's not always written the same way. And I think there's going to be a diversity of ways that's accomplished. So I'm not really sure.
Oh, yeah.
How one determines whether something has a sufficient degree of assertion of conformity to allow that assertion to be now made in a different form of language, and then a different form of language, and a different form of language through the chain.
Really good point. Okay, how about the supplier warrants that the software originates from an OpenChain conformant program as verified by the supplier or as verified by a provider to the supplier. And then we have someone responsible for checking that that program did indeed meet the requirements of the standard. And then we can go to them. What might work there is the standard itself at the final 2 requirements asks you to collect the evidence of how you verified this program is operational.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as you have a definition of what verify means through
Yeah.
the entire chain, I mean, I'm wondering just from an efficacy standpoint, if it's only the last 2 rungs of the ladder so far, I guess if it long, I mean, I guess as long as it starts in the very beginning and there aren't more than 2 rungs of the ladder before someone starts having to verify and it's clear what verify means, that probably works. As long as the level of verification, I mean, it's up to a company whether they feel that was enough of verification, but as long as there's a standardized expectation of what that verification is, and if that exists in some other document or the actual standard, then that's probably okay.
That's a good point. It's a very good point.
I would actually like to know or get a clarification on what you mean by an OpenChain ISO conformant program, because the self-certification equals the ISO certification, right? But well, would you actually need a verification if a company has an ISO 5230 certification? I think companies might be a bit more critical about self-certified suppliers, right?
Correct.
So maybe we should, yeah. That's not easy, though.
No,
but maybe
I think
we
you're
should.
right. Somehow we need to have a way that catches self-certification, third-party certification to double check.
Because if you have an official ISO certification, you might not have to prove or verify everything, right? Because the ISO certification definitely catches your suppliers as well. But the self-certification might be another aspect.
My suggestion is that we add a section in the model provisions to double check is the program being referred to a self-certified program or a third-party certification, so that we can have that clarified. But I think that would belong in a next section rather than base inclusion.
Yes.
Like, determination of the type of program in play.
Yeah.
Steve made an that's a fantastic point, and I'm going to put a note here. Okay. So this would be just putting this here for myself. Self-certification versus party. Okay. Very, very important. Okay, so Steve made a suggestion. This is, sorry, a digression, Chris. We'll come back to your item in a moment. Just Steve made a suggestion that maybe we don't need the second paragraph here because program guidelines aren't part of the ISO standard itself. So as long as we warrant that the software came through a conformant program, maybe that's enough. As opposed to further requiring that it is affirmed to comply with the requirements of that program.
I think it makes sense to delete it, because with the as far as it is aware in brackets,
yeah,
it's not really, it's like okay, if you know, you're okay, but if you don't know, it's okay as well. So it doesn't have any real restriction, right?
True. And just for clarification for anyone who's on the line who isn't aware, the brackets are there as an option, so someone can like get rid of further warrants and so on like that. But if it's there as an option, it does mean that it'd be a negotiation point, and any supplier that didn't go for, as far as I'm aware, would be opening themselves up to, taking on responsibility, which they might want to avoid at any cost. So, as Hannah pointed out, that could be a point that mightn't be so important to keep that sentence. And as Steve pointed out, that might be something that in its current form isn't useful because it talks about program guidelines. My question is, if we chop that paragraph, at least for that sentence, at least for now, will that gravely upset anyone on this call? Okay, if no one is gravely upset, then my beautiful but clumsy language is therefore removed at this juncture. Let's go back to Chris's point. Control is not defined. So this is the question of then the supplier warrants that the software originates from an OpenChain ISO conformant program. And the next section we need, the optional section, is to potentially identify where that program is in the chain. And this initial language was designed to encourage that. But I want to check if anyone has suggestions for better language to help check where it is in the chain. Jeff, over to you.
Oh, I was just getting ready to make a comment. So let me just hold off for a minute on this one.
Okay. All right. So
do we need to have anything like under the control of the supplier? Because if you are passing through software directly from your supplier to your customer, and
yes,
your supplier is providing you with something that is conformant, can't you just say, well, it's conformant to pass it on?
this would be designed for the customer company to identify whose head to chop off.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be to allow them to, in the contract language or in the negotiation language, to have it clear who's the party claiming that they got this right. And that would allow them to immediately go back and shake that party's tree. This would be to prevent the situation where you're hopping back through the supply chain, where everyone's like, oh yeah, it came through a conformant program, and no one can remember where it was. And it takes you several months to get 22 companies deep.
Okay.
And it may be multiple.
Yeah.
I'm delivering a single piece of software that I built myself, my team built, and that's under the control of me, the supplier. I may be just white labeling something else. I may have contractors. I may be bundling two different pieces of software from two different OpenChain conformant programs because I'm aggregating materials, which, reality is messy. Do we have to be so specific that it's, that every case is measured? Maybe we do. Specific is terrific. But I kind of like calling out the language. So when I'm on the other side of the table, I can say, did you really build this? And if not, who did? Because that's, when I'm looking at my supply chain, I want to know who's building it. And people are sometimes shy about not really disclosing that they don't have developers. They're just white labeling something. So I like the language there, so I can have a point of discussion about who actually built it and where did it come from.
I wonder if we could improve that language slightly with exactly that in mind.
How about we just say, instead of a conformant program, we say an identified conformant program?
Ooh. Now that's a good point. The identification point, I think, works. So this was a clumsy attempt to work on the identification, and maybe that's where we need to have language explicitly just calling it out. From an OpenChain conformant program or programs. And then we have a section talking about the location of the programs from identified sources listed in an appendix to this agreement or similar. Or originating or similar. I'm not sure what type of language could work here.
Should we have a placeholder for a carve out? You know, if I'm a large reseller or a large organization, maybe 80% of the software I'm delivering is coming from a conformant program, but 2 pieces are not. Maybe that just means my whole program is not conformant and I'm not ready yet. But you know, the larger the company is, the less likely they are to have everything conformant if they're aggregating multiple pieces of technology.
Maybe, I'm not sure, defined components perhaps? I just wonder if you think perhaps if we said defined components of the software, that could work. I guess it could. Okay, I'm just gonna. So that would allow for a carve out. And then perhaps to have, you know, a clause and then being specified in some document or similar. I was wondering if anyone could help with that language.
This is sort of what I was driving at with the documentation that I sent over, is a sort of define a supplier information pack, which is sort of basically contains information like this.
Excellent. So perhaps what we can do is jump ahead here and just say the supplier information pack.
Yeah.
And we will later include that more explicitly. And Andrew, I really like the material you produced, which essentially gives us the supplier information pack. If they fill that out,
Yeah, I mean, the way the workflow works in my mind is that so you basically provide a bunch of questions. It's sort of due diligence process. So as the customer, you supply a bunch of questions to the supplier and say, you know, can you answer these questions? And each question basically correlates with a specific requirement of the OpenChain specification. So then that gives them sort of opportunity to sort of reply. It's like a sort of due diligence questionnaire in the answers, essentially.
And then we could have this, just as a thought, from a program of programs. You know, adhering to aspects. Just a thought. I'm not sure if that's helpful at all. I just put that down as an alternative. If they can't confirm it comes from a program, maybe they could confirm that it comes from almost a program and the details are in the supplier information pack. or is that a path upon which madness lies?
I like the idea, Shane, and others, of you either can make a flat statement, or alternatively, you can have an alternative where you provide more information in some kind of appendix. So yeah, I agree that there should be some ability to explain if something isn't 100%, because at least encourages a lot of conformance. And of course, people will feel pressure to be fully conformant, but at least where they can indicate that there is potential non-conformance, it still really helps the procurement process.
I would agree. I like the idea of a supplier information pack, especially when you get beyond a single piece of software. It's nice having the pages of documentation. It also allows me to search or grep my database for the names of a company or a program a little easier than just the generic contract language we have here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, personally, I think this is going in a really positive direction for us. And we know from experience that if we start them on this slippery slope of getting more and more conformant, then that is exactly the process we need to convert more and more of the supply chain. Very few companies out of the tens of thousands out there are ready to say we're conformant now. Okay, Andrew, you're unmuted, I see. I got an updated version of your document, so I'll dump it
Yeah,
into the
great.
document.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of respond to Stephen's comment that he's put in the chat about sort of freezing the SBOM, which I absolutely agree with. I don't know if this is sort of reference to the supplier information pack, but the idea of the supplier information pack, it's contains things such as sort of a broad description of the software. So we're not going into details of what the components are, unless there are specific reasons for doing that. It's more about how the software is developed, and it's, as I say, it's essentially a response to a set of questions, which I can also provide, and those questions are really designed to substitute for the OpenChain specification for companies that are not OpenChain conformant themselves. So it asks the questions about how do you run your conformance program? Do you have a conformance program?
Yeah.
Do you have a policy in place? So I completely agree that we don't want to get to the situation where we have an SBOM, which is sort of somehow incorporated into a legal document. You're absolutely right. I think that would be a rather unhelpful way to go.
It'd be a case of see the 27,000 pages of Appendix 8.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it wasn't a specific response. I mean, when you mentioned Splat information pack, I was fine. It was just more when we start mentioning carve-outs and mentioning specific lists of components, I thought, well, that might lead to see Appendix 4, or
yeah.
better yet,
No,
don't.
absolutely. Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm sort of using this this structure with clients already, and the sort of supplier information pack is normally a couple of pages. It doesn't necessarily need, it can be if it has to be, but it could quite easily be a page or two.
And looking at the material, it's very much, to what extent here are you meeting the requirements of the ISO standard? Everything here is,
yes.
yeah, I'm affirming this, I'm affirming that, I'm affirming the other. So, yeah. That's brilliant. I think we've made huge progress here with the sample wording. The only thing I wanted to change right now was to suggest that down here, this mentions, the final item here mentions program guidelines. How do I get rid of that? There we go. Program guidelines. And as Steve pointed out, program guidelines aren't in the agreement. So it seems that the supplier not warranting that the fact that the software, adheres to a program or came through a program. I think we should just change this. an OpenChain conformant program. There, that's my thought. The supplier does not warrant that use, modification, or further distribution by the customer of the software constitutes a continuation of adherence to an OpenChain conformant program. What do you think? Could that work?
It does, but it made me ask a question about, if I'm a reseller and I'm supplying, we up above, two up above, Shane, we say,
Yep.
yes, it's coming from either our program or somebody else's. And then we have at line 46, we're basically saying, hey, if I pass it on, I'm not saying it constitute a continuation of adherence.
Yes.
So we don't, I guess we don't want to discount the fact that people are making things through OpenChain conformant programs and that resellers might be passing it on. Do we want to cut it short and say, once you resell it, the OpenChain conformance is dead, or that there is a mechanism for continuing OpenChain conformance?
I don't think it actually has that problem, because if you, when you get it from your supplier, they're warranting it. If you pass it on, it's no longer their responsibility to warrant it, it's yours. And I think that's fine, isn't it?
My read is that it's okay, but it's an optional component, so it would be one of those negotiation items.
Well, I like it because it doesn't allow you to sprinkle magic pixie dust and say, oh, we got it from a good supplier, therefore we don't have to do anything. I like it.
You see, that's where, not to whine, but that's where I had this language originally, which I'm not inserting it to keep it, but that's why I had the thing where the supplier is warranting that this software right now actually complies with the program guidelines. So not just it came through a program that my supplier gave me, but that as far as I know, I'm warranting that it actually meets those requirements, even though, hypothetically here, the origin of the software could be a supplier of the supplier. And as they're handing it to you, they're warranting that not only did it go through a program as far as they're aware, but it actually meets the requirements of that program. Which I guess is where we are here.
And I think it's okay. I think it's fine to say that you warrant that it passes your program at the point you pass it on. And once someone else does something else to it, it's their responsibility.
Yeah.
Your responsibility is ended, but that doesn't mean to say that your warrant was invalid. It's still valid as in terms of what you've passed on.
Yeah.
For somebody else to not make it worse. Just the same way with open source licenses, the originator of the software doesn't provide a warranty, but in many cases, someone who passes on can choose to add their own warranty as long as it doesn't place obligations on the originator.
I'm just wondering if it would make sense to have the continuity then, not just that the software originates from a program, that it complies with the requirements of a program at the time of delivery, and then continues that they don't.
Again, the software itself doesn't comply with the requirements. It's the people and the processes that comply with the requirements of the program.
Yeah. So perhaps, again, that doesn't work. Okay. So the thought here is we might be missing something. Andrew, thank you so much. Catch you next time. We might be missing something here, not just originating from the program, but it adheres to the requirements outlined by the program. So what we're looking for here is that the software would actually be coming with the SBOM. It's actually been checked for its license and so on. So it might be a nuance of language, but it seems we might be missing a point. Impacted. I'm not doing the language here.
Now, is the concern, Shane, that there's the equivalent of license laundering, that saying, oh yeah, our company's OpenChain conformant, but not the software we gave you. Like, is
Yeah.
that a possibility that if I call myself, if I am self-certified as OpenChain conformant, can I give bad software to people?
Right. And what I'd be worried about here is that someone might argue that they give you the software and it turns out it doesn't have an SBOM. And you say, well, you know, that's clearly not meeting the requirements that we see in this ISO standard. And the person says, oh, it came from an OpenChain conformant program, but we never said that all aspects of the software would meet the program requirements. It's just a thought about potentially locking it in.
Well,
Might not.
in answer to Jeff's query, my understanding is that you can declare yourself to be OpenChain compliant and still have deliveries coming from your organization that are not conformant because they haven't been through the program because they
Yeah.
were already in flight or whatever at the point when you became conformant. But the first paragraph says the software went through the program, so that's okay.
Yep. Okay. If it's fine, it's fine. And we can always come back to it later if someone says it's not fine.
Sorry, was Anna going to say something perhaps?
No? Okay. We've made tremendous progress here in that we actually have some sample wording that's been rattled a bit and I think is looking pretty spiffy. And we have Andrew's fantastic contribution here, which I'm going to commit to this version 0.2, but we have to do work here on filling it out into the format, which allows us to explain, a little more detail of what's going on. Because all of these are model provisions, each item. So we want to probably put some explanatory material around it to help people. But for today, I think we're done. We're nearly at the hour, and we have covered a lot with refining the first suggestion. Thank you, everyone, for amazing contributions, especially Anna, Chris, Jeff, Steve, and of course, Andrew, who's missing, but gave us tremendous material before he had to go to his next call. For those of you who put comments in the chat I didn't get to, I do apologize. My focus was on sticking with everything related to the fact that we were dealing with lawyers, probably negotiating procurement agreements and contracts. So anything related to other topics like general self-certification and so on, as if it didn't relate to the procurement discussion, I didn't get to it in the chat because we just didn't have time. That said, we had a fantastic contribution touching on exactly one of the key points, self-certification and third party from Anna, which fits perfectly into procurement. So for those people who were leaving comments in the chat about org self-certifying and what that would mean, don't worry, we're doing this through the optics of lawyers and procurement and contracts. And we will be touching on that topic in the next call with an issue created by Anna, which is brilliant, helps us tremendously. Thank you all. Have a beautiful day. And I really appreciate your time.